Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in comparative literature. Today, we are digging into a classic. This is about as classic as you get. Today, we are talking about Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. I originally picked this up because it is one of these age gap differences. It turns out that Anna is a bit older than Vronsky, but then I realized that this went way, way beyond my discussion of the age gap, and I really needed to just talk about this novel in some general terms because I think it's one of these books that people avoid just because it's so long and it seems sort of intimidating, but this book is so juicy. It's juicy, and frankly, when it is not juicy, you just go ahead and skim. You skim. There is a lot of pages of one character in particular out there scything, just like out there cutting the grass, or their long descriptions of what's happening in the Zemstvos, these political bodies in Russia in the late 19th century. You just zip right through those. You just skip on through. And honestly, it is some of the most moving and most entertaining literature that I have read in a long time. Those of you who are on the YouTube must have noticed right away, I've got a little bit of a get-up going. I've got a little bit of a salute to Anna Karenina. I will admit that I spent some time looking for my faux fur Russian hat. That would have been even more dramatic and amazing, but I think this is kind of a close second. For those of you on the podcast, I've got honestly, what is kind of a crazy looking updo, and one of these tops that looks a tiny bit like maybe something you would have seen in Imperial Russia at the end of the 19th century. I will note, in fact, that this is all my own hair. Lots of description of hair in Anna Karenina and like these women with gigantic formations on their heads of other people's hair. But this is not only my own hair, but in fact, I did it myself. The reason we're getting into the spirit is because I ran into a listener yesterday. And actually, to be honest, when I say I ran into a listener, I ran into one of my oldest friends. And she was telling another friend about how I have a podcast. And she was describing to this friend all about how I always dress up, which actually made me understand that friend had not been listening recently, because in fact, I have not been dressing up recently. So she was kind of busted. But it did make me remember and think of the fact that Anna Karenina is the perfect opportunity to pick that back up. She also, when this old college friend was telling her friend about my podcast, it made me realize that I have not talked in a long time about what foxing is. The foxed page comes from this idea of those little tiny brown speckles that you will have on the pages of very old, very beloved books. There was a lot of trouble trying to spell it. It was F-O-X-T for a minute. This is a group of three, I think perimenopausal, if not menopausal women. Nobody's brains are really functioning the way they used to be. But we finally got across F-O-X-E-D. I told them what foxing meant, and I was inspired. As always, we begin with this question of why read the book. I hinted at it a minute ago, but this is a book that not only is one of these classics that people are intimidated by, with honestly no reason to be intimidated, but this is also a book that is offering profound escape. We are into April of 2025, and I, for one, am still really valuing the idea of literature as an escape. I was also, though, a bit surprised and a tiny bit inspired and actually a tiny bit bored by the fact that Anna Karenina also is very politically involved. This is a book about a country that is undergoing profound changes. And I have to say, I felt much more optimistic about the changes that were happening in Russia in the 19th century than some of the changes that are happening in our country today. But I was really interested in this parallel. The thing that I really recognize this time, and of course every time I go back and reread a classic, it is a slightly different experience. And what I realize this time is that this is a book that has something for everyone. There are many, many strands, and some of them are very dude-like. Again, I hate to be gendered about these things, but we do have the political part. We have actually a lot of stuff about agriculture, a lot of stuff about how to build an empire. But we also have these very juicy strands that all have to do with family. We have domestic discord with Dolly and Stiva. We have this crazy extreme love triangle between Anna, Alexei Alexandrovich, her husband, and Vronsky. Then we have this very grounded love, this very idealistic and almost sort of angelic love on the part of Kitty for a couple of different men. This is a good time to tell you there are not going to be any spoilers. I'm not going to say anything that's going to destroy the plot for you. And I will say there is a lot of plot in this book. Another thing that I noticed about the reading this time is that, yes, there are lots of strands of plot in general. There are lots of strands of domestic and kind of romantic interests. But I was also really taken this time by the idea of how rounded all of these characters are and how ambivalent and how real and how complicated and nuanced all of these relationships are. I think Karenin, meaning Alexei Alexandrovich Karenin, Anna's husband, is, I think, one very good example of this. He is someone who is really awkward and cold. We've got that terrible description of him in the beginning with his hat and his ears. He's someone who's like sort of deeply repellent to both Anna and the reader, but he is someone who ends up being kind of heroic. He is someone who develops a deep and very unlikely love with someone who is very vulnerable and, in fact, in some ways saves a life. And we can kind of do that with all of the characters. I'm not sure we can do it with Vronsky. In many ways, Vronsky is just like not that great a dude from the beginning to the end. But it is so much to Tolstoy's credit that when we have all of these different characters, Anna, Stiva, Levin, these are characters that could be types, and yet they are not. So for those of you who like an agenda, here's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk very quickly about the novel, its publication, where it fits in terms of literary movements. We're going to talk a little bit about Russia. I'm going to read a little clip to you to give you a sense of what Russia was up to at this point, the upheaval that the country was experiencing. We're then going to dive into the text. We're going to look at the title, the epigram. We're going to look very quickly at the cover art of my copy. I'll say right up front, it's very appealing and very beautiful. It's the one that has like kind of, it looks to me like young girls' knees and young girls' hands. Those of you on the YouTube can see it. And she like bare hands and bare knees and these beautiful hydrangeas and actually a very appealing font. It's a very appealing cover in many, many ways. My question is like, whose hands and whose knees are those? I mean, maybe Kitty, but something about Anna Karenina in big letters right across the front of this makes me think that we're supposed to believe those are Anna's hands and knees, and just doesn't really fit for me in terms of logic. I will also say, while we're looking at the cover of this book in particular, this is the translation that I read most recently. It's the one that I like the best. I've looked at a couple of them. We're not going to dig too deeply into the question of translation today, although it is endlessly fascinating to me. But this translation by Richard Peviar and Larisa Volokhonsky, I hope I said that right, those two guys really lucked out because it is their translation that Oprah picked for her book club book. And it is an excellent translation, but that selection also really put them on the map. So cover art, title, epigraph, we're going to dive into the first paragraph just to take a close look at the narrator. The narrative stance in this book is so interesting, and in many ways I think it is one of the things that makes it feel so accessible. Then we're going to move on just to touch briefly on what I think people normally take away from this book, kind of your typical experience of reading it, what people tend to remember, what they tend to focus on. And then we're going to take a look at a slightly more nuanced interpretation of what Anna Karenina has to offer. Okay, we're now going to situate Anna Karenina a little bit. I don't always feel like this is an important thing to do, but with a classic like this, I think it's actually very interesting to have a sense of where the work falls in terms of history and in terms of literary movements. So Tolstoy was born in 1828. He died in 1910. This is crazy to me. War and Peace came out in 1868, and Anna Karenina came out in 1875. That's amazing, 7 years later. I mean, these are fat books. These are really, really long books this guy is writing, and he seemed to be just really churning them out. I think it's important to remember that Anna Karenina came out in 8 different installments. This is very much like a Dickens thing. It was coming out as a periodical. Honestly, coming out a little bit like something like White Lotus. I cannot imagine that people were waiting quite the way that I was. We watched the finale last night. Wow. But so the book came out in these 8 different parts. The reason why I say it's important is because in some ways, there's a certain amount of repetition that happens in the book, a certain amount of kind of really delving into things that feel like we have already delved into them. And part of that is in order to remind the reader of what the hell's going on. I also think in some ways it just explains the length. If you have readers reading something over the course of 2 years, I think that you can expect them to indulge a little more in long descriptions of someone out scything the grasses in Russia. It was inspired by a real event by a woman who in a nearby neighborhood who was married, had an affair, and when everything came to a head and was discovered, she did take her own life by throwing herself in front of a train. I was totally fascinated by the idea that originally it was really just the Anna parts that were in it. It was the Anna and Vronsky and Karenin parts, and that the Levin and Kitty parts were layered in later. In some ways, that is surprising and interesting. In others, it's totally not surprising because I do think the 2 parts kind of operate in tandem, and I really like the way that they weave together, both with the involvement of Vronsky and Levin and Stiva, and Anna, for that matter, tying these two plot strands together. But in many ways, they do really feel separate. And I also really love the contrast between the two. In many ways, the Kitty and Levin story, the Kitty Vronsky Levin story, is a really interesting parallel for everything that is happening with Anna Vronsky and Karenina. I do think it's also interesting to note the way that Tolstoy sort of wrote himself into the novel. This time through, I have to say, I was not scouring the notes at the end, but Peviar and Volokonsky do a very good job of informing you in the back of if there's, a political term or a historical term that is not familiar, which there are plenty of them. They give you very good, brief, thorough descriptions in the back. And there is a lot of polemicizing. There is a lot of Tolstoy talking about these different questions at the moment. There was the woman question. There was the question of the peasants. There was the question of teaching and schooling. There was a question of language. All of these different things were very polemical at the moment, and Tolstoy was certainly weighing in. The way he was doing this, in large part, was through the character of Levin. So Leo is what we would say in English, but Lev would be the Russian. So his name is, in fact, very close to Levin. He was not even being very cagey about the whole thing. And there are a couple of other things, like when he asked his wife to marry him, he proposed in the same way that Levin proposes. Tolstoy also made his bride, didn't make her, but like offered that she read through his diary before they got married, which is just kind of an interesting choice. So he did marry a woman named Sophia, who in many ways is very much like Dolly in the novel. And Sophia had 8 children, literally went through 16 pregnancies. There are occasional parts where Tolstoy is describing how tired a woman looks. And honestly, I was like, he probably was looking at poor Sophia, who had been pregnant 16 times. And frankly, very sadly, lost half of those babies, but meanwhile was raising 8 children. So I've given you a little sense of the publication of the novel and how Tolstoy was involved even as a character in the book. But I also want to situate the book a little bit in terms of literary movements. In my mind, this is very firmly in the realist tradition. If you look at Wikipedia, it says that it is a bridge to modernism. In my sense, it is not experimental enough to really fit the idea of what a modernist novel was. To me, the modernist novel comes after World War I. That is people who are writing in very experimental ways, like Virginia Woolf, like James Joyce, like William Faulkner a little bit later in the United States. To me, Tolstoy is actually a very good example of the realist novel. So if you think about the 18th century, 1700s, all of the Enlightenment, we had a lot of writing of essays, we had a lot of poetry, we were very into science at that point, and frankly, quite a bit of hubris, thinking that we were really understanding everything about the universe and down to the atom. Actually, I'm not really sure. There was a lot of atomic stuff happening in the 18th century. Then in the beginning of the 19th century, we have a few more novels being written. Jane Austen, of course, is at the beginning of the 19th century, like the teens, 18 teens. But people date often the beginning of the real realist movement with the publication of Madame Bovary in 1851. And in my opinion, Tolstoy is doing very much what Flaubert was trying to do. And what that is writing a book that contains everything. It is a book that is somewhat democratizing in the sense that you are talking about all of the different classes. You're talking about some very sort of nitty-gritty things, what they're eating, how they're hunting, how they're spending their time, how they're working. We have a lot of description of people working in this novel. And just the sheer amount of description and the level of detail in the description does make it feel to me like a very realist novel. It's not particularly experimental, not in terms of its narrative stance. You've got a pretty typical omniscient narrator. We do some interesting things with time. He very happily at times will jump ahead in time and it does so very deftly, but you don't have a lot of back and forth in time. We don't have a lot of, certainly not any stream of consciousness, which is again going to come with the modernist movement. So for me, this is a very, very good example of the realist novel. And one of the reasons why I think that is important is this is not a book that is particularly difficult to read. It's difficult in the sense that it is long, but if you're looking for a long book to really sink on into, or maybe you want to listen to it on Audible, I have to say, one night of terrible insomnia, this book put me right to sleep on the Audible. But the fact that it is a realist novel really speaks to its accessibility. This is a book that in many ways is very easy to understand and is just delightfully engaging. So perhaps more important than how this fits in literary history is how it fits in, actual history. What I'm going to do here, I was thinking of taking notes and sort of trying to digest this for you. I'm just going to read the paragraph that I found very helpful in Wikipedia, which sounds a little bit like cheating, but I'm curating this for you. Here is what Wikipedia says. The events in the novel take place against the backdrop of rapid transformations as a result of the liberal reforms initiated by Emperor Alexander II of Russia. Principal among them, these of emancipation reform in 1861, followed by judicial reform, including a jury system, military reforms, the introduction of elected official government, Zemstvos, the fast development of railroads, banks, industry, telegraphy, the rise of new business elites, and the decline of the old landed aristocracy, a freer press, the awakening of public opinion, the pan-Slavic movement, the woman question, volunteering to aid Serbia in its military conflict with the Ottoman Empire in 1876, etc. I think that's funny. I don't know what the etc. there would be, but frankly, whoever wrote this Wikipedia, man, this is like, that was a very well done little synthesis there. And you could hear a couple of the things that are very germane. The idea of the landed aristocracy as fading, the idea of agricultural reforms, the complexity of those Zemstvos. In the novel, we have the character of Levin having been involved in the Zemstvos and having been very frustrated by how they are not, in fact, working. Of course, the idea of trains and the train system as being relatively new is very important because of trains as having a very large presence in the beginning of the novel and at the end of the novel. I think in the Wikipedia thing, it's literally like there's a whole section on trains that comes up very, very high, like that trains are a big motif in the novel, which is in fact true. But that is an argument I'm about to pick apart in a moment. So I think some people get a little bogged down in some of the political stuff, some of the polemics that Tolstoy is really putting out there. But I think if you have even just like a very basic inkling of all of the changes that were happening in the country, it really is much more interesting to dive into. So now we're going to actually dive into the text. I want to take a moment to talk about the title. I think the title is hugely important in this novel. The main thing that it does is really put all of our focus on Anna Karenina. Really, she emerges as the heroine and really, in some ways, kind of like the most remarkable and the most memorable character, which is really interesting because if you step back for a second, she is one of the driving people, but the kind of airtime that she gets and the way that we get to know her and the way that we follow her story, it's not hugely imbalanced. We have a lot of Levin, we have a lot of all of these other characters. We do follow Anna very closely, but in some ways, I think that the title is a bit of a kind of misfocus in some ways. I will also say War and Peace, that was an interesting title for me because I really did not want to read that book for a long time because it was literally called War and Peace. And there are, really long stretches of that book that are about the Napoleonic Wars. And I have to say that I skipped through some of those. I just went ahead and skimmed right on through some of those sections, very much the way that I skimmed through some of the agricultural reforms in Anna Karenina. But War and Peace is like this crazy, soapy, it's not like a rom-com, but that is a book that has everything to do with like very kind of romantic and very kind of interpersonal stuff. I mean, that is a book, again, not a difficult book, a very entertaining book. And I find the title was really off-putting and in fact really did not represent what I was diving into. I think Tolstoy was a little bit guardrail to guardrail here too, because we have War and Peace, which seemed like it was too much focused on that one strain and really gave short shrift to what I found the most interesting part of War and Peace, in much the same way that Anna Karenina focuses all of our attention on this one person, and in fact on this one story arc, and in many ways on kind of the one conclusion that one draws from what happens with Anna. The actual title itself, Anna Karenina, has caused all of this stir in the literary world. So in Russia, if you have a woman, you add an A at the end. It's very much like lots of languages that have gender that come with words. So Karenin, Alexei Alexandrovich Karenin, does not have an A at the end, but Anna Karenina would. So in the Russian, it would be Anna Karenina. In English, you would not have the A at the end because English, in the English translation, would not in fact add that A. At one point, Nabokov made this big deal about how the only time you add the A is if it is someone who is known perhaps by her last name and because she is like a starlet. The example that he uses was La Pavlova, who was a dancer, and that was someone that we knew really kind of like, I don't know, it's like Beyonce, maybe, that we know by this kind of one name, or like Sade. I'm just going to really age myself, really date myself there. But when he said that, then there was all of this stuff about how, like, Anna is not, in fact, a ballerina, and she is not, in fact, a starlet. And it caused all of this really, heated controversy, when, in fact, I think it is not that big a deal. I understand that if you are writing an English translation of the novel, it might feel like the right thing to have the English translation of the name, Anna Karenina, because that is the way that you would do it in English. But I find, I mean, whatever, like, I really have no problem with conserving the Russian of Anna Karenina in the title. I mean, you're already transliterating from the Russian alphabet, so you've already, taken a big leap toward the English, and in many ways, I think that leap is plenty. Okay, we're now going to dive into the text itself. I'm choosing to look through the frame of the narrative stance. We're looking at the way that Tolstoy has such a deft way to narrate this, and that really it leads to like the huge accessibility, but also the wide-ranging nature of the book. But it also, looking at this first part in order to, sort of dive into the narrative, allows us just to look at how amazing the prose is. So we're going to dive in to the first of the 8 parts with the ultra famous first sentence of this novel. All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So, I mean, in some ways that just is very basic, and it really speaks to this idea that, like, any literature should really have some sort of drama to it. But it also has an interesting statement about realism, because this idea of talking about the family, and really talking about the family in a very granular way, was a new thing. So this idea of the realist novel as sort of getting into the nitty gritty, I think what Tolstoy is doing here in part is he's like, don't worry, you're not going to be bored even though I'm talking about the family novel, because in fact I'm going to talk about an unhappy one that is not only unhappy and therefore dramatic, but is also unhappy in its own, read unusual, way. And the other important thing about this is the typical omniscient narrator. This is someone who is making a very, very large statement about, literally all families. So you have this sense of this very authoritative and all-knowing narrator who is kicking things off. We then move a little closer, and importantly, we are moving into the domestic sphere. We are moving into the house. And the way that Tolstoy is portraying the household in such detail is also really revolutionary and important. So here we go. All was confusion in the Oblonskys' house. The wife had found out that the husband was having an affair with their former French governess, and had announced to the husband that she could not live in the same house with him. This situation had continued for 3 days now, and was painfully felt by the couple themselves, as well as by all the members of the family and household. So we're moving into the house. We find out it is the Oblonskys' house, but we're still pretty removed, because at this point we're talking about the husband and the wife and the people who are working there. It's also very important, though, the members of the household, including the staff, the working people, is also revolutionary. This is the kind of democratizing thing that the realist novel was doing. We are not just talking about the people, in the drawing rooms like you would have with Dangerous Liaison, but in fact we are talking, which was actually in the 18th century. That was a very early thing. That was epistolary, not my favorite genre. This is like letters written back and forth, which actually is an interesting contrast with this kind of like wide-ranging omniscient narrator in this novel. Then not only do we have the perspective of the people, the members of the household, but we have their thoughts. He's not saying like, he's not entering into the mind and speaking from their voice, but he is giving us their thoughts. And we're talking here about the entire household, the members of the family and household. They felt that there was no sense in their living together, and that people who meet accidentally at any inn have more connection with each other than they, the members of the family and the household of the Oblonskys. So quick note on the translation here. You hear a lot of repetition in Tolstoy. There was this very big deal that he was writing in a Russian that was very much like kind of the everyday Russian. He was not writing in this very formal Russian, which would have been kind of the more typical that you would find in literature. It was very revolutionary for him to be writing in this like slightly more coarse Russian, and a lot of that kind of plain repetition, which adds to the accessibility and also the force of the writing, is something that later translations keep. Earlier translations would be like, oh my God, it's so embarrassing that Tolstoy's not a great writer. Let's just go ahead and like iron out some of this stuff and put in, a couple of pronouns instead of all of this accumulation of nouns. So moving on. The wife would not leave her rooms. The husband was away for the 3rd day. The children were running all over the house as if lost. The English governess quarreled with the housekeeper and wrote a note to a friend asking her to find her a new place. The cook had already left the premises the day before at dinner time. The kitchen maid and coachman had given notice. So a couple of very important things here. We're going pretty deeply into the staff here, and their reaction is very strong. What has happened is an affair. We have Stiva, who is Anna Karenina's brother. We have him, he's had an affair with the governess. Totally typical. I mean, literally, like still even today, something that a lot of people can relate to. But what's interesting here is that it is causing this giant reaction and a huge kind of moral condemnation on the part of all of the people in the staff. But what is also important is that very quickly in the novel, I'm not really spoiling much, I don't think here, Stiva is forgiven. Anna comes to town and essentially convinces his wife, Anna's sister-in-law, Dolly, to stay with her husband, to forgive him. And Stiva is someone who's kind of a serial philanderer. He's someone who is unfaithful again and again. He's trying hard. He's kind of like weirdly like this charming character who seems a little bit like a buffoon. Oh my gosh, you guys, one of the huge pleasures of reading Anna Karenina is then you can go and watch the Tom Stoppard movie with Keira Knightley and Jude Law. I mean, oh gosh, I mean, even if you're not going to read the book, you absolutely must watch that movie. I think the reviews were maybe kind of mixed. I loved that movie so much. It's Matthew Macfadyen from Succession who plays Stiva, and he is unbelievably good. In fact, that might be part of the reason why I'm so charmed by the character when I read the book, is because in my head I literally have Matthew Macfadyen. This is the perfect segue because we are going to move closer to the character of Stiva. So if you're a Succession watcher, you can now, or Pride and Prejudice, frankly. I mean, he was an amazing Mr. Darcy. But you can go ahead and have Matthew Macfadyen in your head as I'm reading this next part. On the third day after the quarrel, Prince Stepan Arkadyevich Oblonsky, Stiva as he was called in society, woke up at his usual hour, that is, at 8 o'clock in the morning. Not in his wife's bedroom, but in his study on a Morocco sofa. He rolled his full, well-tended body over on the springs of the sofa, as if wishing to fall asleep again for a long time, tightly hugged the pillow from the other side, and pressed his cheek to it. But suddenly he gave a start, sat up on the sofa and opened his eyes. Yes, how did it go? He thought, recalling his dream. How did it go? Yes. So then he goes on to remember the dream, which I will spare you. Oh, there's an adage that you learn in, when you're getting a when you're getting an MFA. It's like tell a dream, lose a reader. And I find dreams. I mean, it's just like that's the subject of an entire other thing, but I'm going to spare you Stiva's dream. The important thing here is that we are moving into this very realist territory, and this is part of what I love about this book. We are finding him in not in his wife's room, which is revealing. We now know that, each of them have their own room, and you think, oh, that must have been typical for a prince in Russia at that time. But you have him on the sofa. I think Morocco must be a type of leather. That's what I'm imagining. But we know that it is, a sofa made of a certain type of fabric. We have him moving the pillow over. The specificity of these kinds of movements and of fabrics and of like the time that people are getting up in the morning, that is all very realist. And it is stuff that I think really makes a world inhabitable and very realistic and really allows you to kind of immerse yourself in the novel. We also have here a very good example of the way that Tolstoy gets in very closely with the character. We began with all happy families are alike, and now we move down to Stiva, who is in fact having quite a crisis. So I want to look at just 3 more examples of this narrative stance. It's also a good way, of course, to look at the prose, but it also shows just the breadth and the different tools that Tolstoy was using as a narrator. So this is on page 73. This is a conversation between Kitty and Anna, and it's also a very important one because they are talking about that really, sort of seismic ball where all of the characters in the book are all together and very exciting things happen. So on page 73, Anna speaks first. And I know why you're inviting me to the ball. You expect a lot from this ball, and you want everyone to be there. You want everyone to take part. Yes, how did you know? Oh, how good to be your age, Anna went on. I remember and know that blue mist, the same as in the mountains in Switzerland, the mist that envelops everything during the blissful time when childhood is just coming to the end, and the path away from that vast, cheerful, and happy circle grows narrower and narrower, and you feel cheerful and eerie entering that suite of rooms, though it seems bright and beautiful. Who hasn't gone through that? Kitty silently smiled. But how did she go through it? I'd so love to know her whole romance, thought Kitty, recalling the unpoetical appearance of Alexei Alexandrovitch, her husband. There's something I know. Stiva told me, and I congratulate you. I like him very much, Anna went on. I met Vronsky at the railway station. Oh my God, there is so much here. So much here. So the important thing I was wanting you to look at there is simply the way that we have Kitty remembering this thing. In this case, it is in quotation marks, which is one of the kind of more obtrusive ways that we have Tolstoy entering into the minds of the characters. But you get a sense from this of the really nimble way that he is introducing not only what these characters are. I mean, we have the romance of Anna, who is thinking of things in this blue mist. We also have a real sense of the tension in the book, this idea that she is thinking of the end of childhood and things are getting sort of darker for her. She is not entering for the first time into these suites. You get a sense that she is a much older woman. I think she's like all of like 27 or something. Don't quote me on that. But the weight that he is giving to each of these women is the kind of thing that we see throughout, whether it is, someone who is working doing manual labor at the train station, or whether it is, Princess Betsy. We have this ability to understand the language and the inner feelings, the thoughts of many different characters, which really opens the novel up in this incredible way. Just a couple of pages later on 75, we have an example of another way that he is entering into the minds of these characters. This is when Anna is together with a bunch of people and suddenly has this maternal pang. The way that maternity functions in the novel is extremely important. In many ways, it is kind of the thing that keeps Anna from really acting on her desire to go just like run off with Vronsky. She really does not want to leave her child. And children in the book also are sort of, they're like held hostage in some ways so that people are not allowed to leave marriages. Notably, that only happens with the women. It definitely happens with Anna. It is certainly not happening with Stiva, her brother. So on page 75, she's talking about a photo album. I'll show you my Seryozha, she added with the smile of a proud mother. Towards 10 o'clock, when she usually said goodnight to her son, and often put him to bed herself before going to a ball, she felt sad to be so far away from him, and whatever they talked about, she kept returning in thought to her curly-headed Seryozha. I mean, honestly, the thing that sticks out to me most in reading that aloud is that they would go to a ball at 10 o'clock at night. It is really good that I was not having to operate here, because I'm definitely in bed by 8:30. But this is a very good example of Tolstoy very effortlessly, we have a little conversation, and then he has this nice synthesis of both what's happening culturally, but then also of what Anna is thinking and feeling. She's very authentically missing her son at this point. So one thing that did happen to me this time in this rereading of the novel, I was very acutely aware of the fact that Tolstoy, as a man in 1870, the book was written presumably, between 1868 when he finished War and Peace and 1875 when the first installment came out. So this is a man who is writing in the middle of the 19th century, and he is writing as if he is a woman, meaning that he is writing in the place he is providing the thoughts and the worries and the sadnesses and the concerns and the romance and the desire of all of the female characters. So there were parts where I was just kind of acutely aware that we had a male narrator, and I want to read one of those. This is well into the book. This is page 358. I'm not going to tell you who he is describing here, just in case that somebody might feel like that's a bit of a spoiler. Both morally and physically, she had changed for the worse. She had broadened out, and her face, when she spoke of the actress, was distorted by a spiteful expression. He looked at her as a man looks at a faded flower he has plucked, in which he can barely recognize the beauty that had made him pluck and destroy it. And despite that, he felt that when his love was stronger, he might have torn that love from his heart had he wished to do so. But now, when it seemed to him, as it did at that moment, that he felt no love for her, he knew that his bond with her could not be broken. This is also an example of some of the figurative language that he uses. It's not bad. This was perhaps, honestly, this was probably like an unfair passage for me to have chosen. But for whatever reason, it jumped out at me in the sense that I was very aware that this was a male narrator. Of course, he is writing from the character of a man, but in some ways, the deftness with which he is writing in both of the genders really stood out for me. Okay, now that we've talked about the narrative stance, we're going to finish up by talking more broadly about the ways that people think about the novel. So I mentioned before the title, I do think that most people's focus is on Anna Karenina, is on her and her character arc. And it's interesting to think, having just finished the novel, about the nuance of the character. I think there are many people who look at her as kind of the epitome of romance. She is, in fact, in a relationship with a man who is very cold, it is a very loveless relationship, and she has this dramatic falling in love experience with a younger man. And I'm not going to spoil it for people, although I think most people know what happens in the end. But things do not go well for her. So I think in many ways people think of her as kind of a victim of a patriarchy. I mean, that might be a hot take for some of you. Some people might think that she got exactly what she deserved because she was someone who was not faithful to her husband. I will underscore again that all of these characters are so nuanced. In many ways, we think that her husband is this cold fish. He's not great. He's certainly not attractive. He doesn't necessarily treat her particularly well, but he also doesn't treat her badly, and he is someone we have lots of sympathy for at different points. And the same thing with Anna. She is someone who's helplessly in love, but this time I also actually felt more critical of her. I think in many ways she is very narcissistic and she is very selfish, and certainly a lot of the things that she does are pointing to her as being someone who is really only thinking about herself and really only doing what she wants to do. So I do think it's very interesting that people think of her as this romantic heroine and in some ways a very tragic figure. A lot is made of this idea of foreshadowing. So we have the very important stuff with the train in the beginning and the train in the end. And lots of people talk about how Tolstoy, because of what happens at the train station in the beginning, that Anna has this sense of this omen, and that Tolstoy, as narrator, is very carefully constructing this idea of this omen, this kind of vision that she has in the beginning, and that her fate is sealed, and that she is just sort of barreling, as a train on tracks toward, her ultimate demise. I do think there's another way to look at it, which is also nuanced, which is simply in her selfishness. I mean, she is someone who in the very beginning has this very romantic experience of falling in love with Vronsky all of a sudden at the beginning at the train station. And in some ways, what she is doing is she has created this desire, and then at every turn, she is fulfilling the desire. And that ultimately leads to the ending of the novel. So I think in some ways you can think of it, and of course it's Tolstoy who's making all of this up, but I think in some ways it's a more interesting thing. Instead of thinking that Tolstoy had from the beginning, he was doing this elaborate train motif, it's in some ways more interesting to look at the ways that Anna, in fact, is making selfish choices at a couple of different very important turns, and is sort of fulfilling this prophecy that she herself created at the beginning. So you can have this idea of this very fatalistic, very fixed progression, in the sense that you have this omniscient narrator and this author who have this very specific fate that this woman is going to be victim of. Or you can look at it more as Anna Karenina, as the character of Anna, in fact, fulfilling her own destiny instead of being sort of fated to do so by these other powers. But this time through, I also think that there's a sort of more interesting interpretation of the novel, and that is if you are to follow the storyline that has to do with Kitty and Levin. I argued it earlier that simply the title of the book makes us focus on this one storyline, but in many ways, I think looking at the relationship between Kitty and Levin, with all of its complexity, and in fact, in many ways, the relationship feels much more realistic, certainly toward the end when we have a more robust relationship between the two of them. I'm trying to say all of this without spoiling anything for anyone, but I was so taken by it. I'll say right now, I mean, it's interesting to me that when I was talking about the Tom Stoppard film earlier, about how it was Anna Karenina, that is the storyline even in the film that stands out for me, when in fact, the storyline with Kitty and Levin is also so amazing. It's Alicia Vikander who is Kitty, and she's so, so beautiful in it. I actually don't remember who plays Levin, which honestly is really in keeping, I think, with how most people feel about Levin all throughout the book. If you're a real Levin, stan, I think that's great. That guy could use all the support that he could get. I think you're probably in the minority, but in many ways, I think you're a more sophisticated thinker and reader than the rest of us. So this is actually a very good place to end. I will just say that this is a book that has so much heart and in many ways has something for everyone. It is dramatic, it's interesting, but I will also tell you that if you're not really down for reading the 1,000 pages, you should just, in fact, go and watch that movie. So I hope this deep dive into a real classic today has been entertaining and enriched your sense of what the book is all about. Maybe now you actually do want to go read it, or maybe you've just had a nice little walk down memory lane and have enjoyed thinking about what is an amazing book for the last 45 minutes. So thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.